May 26, 2026, 10 a.m. The Everett, McKinley, Dirksen, United States Courthouse, Chicago, Illinois. 24th floor, Courtroom of the Honorable John F. Kness, United States District Judge for the Northern District of Illinois. The room is quiet in the particular way federal courtrooms always are. Air conditioning cycling overhead, a low hum of fluorescent lighting, the faint scratch of a court reporter's fingers against her machine. At the defense table, a 40-year-old man from San Jose, California sat motionless as the judge read aloud the sentence. More than 26 years in federal prison, no parole in the federal system, no possibility of early release on good behavior beyond the standard statutory calculation, just 26 years, and whatever remained of the defendant's life after that. The man's name was Darren Hughes, and the case against him was not the product of a confidential informant who got nervous and started talking. It was not the result of a street-level buy and bust in a Chicago alley. It was the product of something far more patient and far more methodical, a sustained federal investigation that tracked narcotics being sold on one of the world's most active darknet marketplaces, traced through cryptocurrency wallets and USPS tracking records, and ultimately connected to a vendor account operating under a screen name behind layers of encryption software, anonymous routing protocols, and what Hughes apparently believed was total anonymity. He was wrong on every single count. To understand what Darren Hughes built, and what ultimately destroyed him, you need to understand what the Nemesis market was and what it represented in the evolving landscape of darknet drug commerce. The Darknet, that portion of the internet accessible only through anonymizing software like the Tor browser, had hosted a succession of major drug market platforms going back more than a decade. Silk Road, the original landmark marketplace, was seized by the FBI in October 2013. Alphabay followed and was taken down in July 2017. Dream Market collapsed in 2019. Hydra, the Russian language platform, was shuttered by German and American authorities in April 2022. With each takedown, vendors and buyers migrated to whatever market had survived or was newly emerging, and the cycle continued. By the early 2020s, Nemesis Market had established itself as one of the more prominent English-language darknet platforms, attracting a significant vendor community offering everything from narcotics to counterfeit documents to stolen financial credentials. Vendors on platforms like Nemesis operated storefronts much like sellers on any legitimate e-commerce site. They built ratings, accumulated reviews, offered promotions to attract new customers, and competed for market share. The currency of trust on these platforms was the vendor feedback score, and experienced darknet shoppers knew how to read those scores to identify reliable suppliers from scammers. Competition between vendors was fierce, marketing mattered, customer service perversely mattered. Hughes, operating under his vendor account on the platform, was not a casual participant. According to the federal prosecution, he ran what investigators described as a full-service methamphetamine distribution operation. He listed methamphetamine for sale across a range of quantities. He offered competitive pricing, and, in a marketing tactic that federal agents would later describe in court documents with a certain dry precision, he offered free samples to new customers. Free samples. The strategy was not unique to Hughes in the darknet vendor ecosystem. Investigators working drug marketplace cases had documented the free sample approach across multiple platforms and multiple product categories. The logic was straightforward and coldly commercial. Get a first-time buyer hooked on the product, establish a vendor relationship, build a review, and convert a one-time sample recipient into a repeat customer. Hughes was, in the clinical language of the court filings, running a business. The distribution mechanism was the United States Postal Service. This was, and remains, the standard logistics infrastructure for darknet drug vendors operating at the domestic level. Vendors package narcotics in vacuum-sealed wrapping to defeat postal X-ray and canine interdiction, conceal the packages in innocuous external containers, greeting card envelopes, household goods boxes, magazine mailers, and drop them at USPS collection points, often rotating post offices to avoid pattern recognition by postal workers. The packages move through the ordinary mail stream alongside birthday cards and Amazon deliveries, and the buyer at the other end simply waits for the mailman. It is a method that federal investigators, postal inspectors, and the DEA had spent years developing countermeasures against, and it is a method that, despite its apparent operational simplicity, leaves a trail. The investigation into Hughes was led by the Drug Enforcement Administration and the United States Postal Inspection Service. The USPS, often underestimated in discussions of federal drug enforcement, is one of the oldest law enforcement agencies in the United States, with a mission that gives it jurisdiction over anything moving through the mail. Postal inspectors had developed substantial expertise in Darknet drug interdiction over the years, working in concert with the DEA, the FBI, and Homeland Security investigations to dismantle vendor operations that relied on USPS delivery. Their methods in cases like this one were well established by the time Hughes's operation came to their attention. Investigators working Darknet cases typically begin from one of several starting points. Sometimes it begins with a package intercept, a suspicious parcel flagged by a postal sorting facility, or a trained canine alert at a distribution center. Sometimes it begins with a controlled purchase, in which an undercover agent or a cooperating buyer makes a transaction on the marketplace, receives the package, and the return address or postmark establishes a geographic anchor for the investigation. Sometimes it begins with marketplace intelligence, gathered through the systematic monitoring of vendor listings, communications, and operational security lapses by the vendors themselves. Most successful takedowns involve some combination of all three. In Hughes's case, the publicly available court record does not spell out in precise detail which thread federal agents pulled first. What the record makes clear is that investigators built a case that satisfied a federal jury in the Northern District of Illinois, a jury that heard the evidence, deliberated, and in November of 2025 returned a verdict of guilty. The precise mechanics of how the DEA and postal inspectors linked the Nemesis vendor account to Darren Hughes, a man physically located in San Jose, California, speak to the investigative architecture that federal agencies have constructed specifically for this category of case. Cryptocurrency was central to that architecture. Darknet markets had operated almost exclusively through Bitcoin in the early years of the ecosystem, though vendors and buyers had progressively shifted toward privacy-focused alternatives like Monero as federal agencies became more sophisticated in blockchain analysis. But even with privacy-enhanced cryptocurrency, the points at which digital money intersects with the real world, exchanges, wallets tied to identifiable accounts, cash-out transactions, create forensic opportunities. The DEA has maintained crypto tracing capability since at least 2013, augmented by relationships with blockchain analytics companies, whose software can trace transaction flows across thousands of wallet hops and identify clusters of addresses that likely belong to a single actor. Reported techniques in cases like this one include what investigators call appeal chain analysis, in which they trace the movement of cryptocurrency from a drug payment through successive wallet addresses, watching for the moment the funds consolidate or move toward a point of exchange. If a vendor ever converts cryptocurrency proceeds to dollars through an exchange with Know Your Customer compliance, one that collects identity documentation, that exchange record becomes a subpoena target. Agents can also examine on-chain patterns to look for timing correlations between marketplace transactions and cryptocurrency movements that suggest the same actor is behind both. Then there was the mail trail. Every package moving through the USPS system generates tracking data. An address that receives an unusual volume of packages from rotating origination points, or that corresponds to a controlled purchase delivery, becomes an investigative target. Conversely, if agents can identify a cluster of outgoing packages from a particular zip code or a particular post office that correlates temporally with Darknet sales activity, that geographic anchor narrows the field. In federal drug cases built on postal evidence, postal inspectors have used everything from mail covers, a legal mechanism allowing the collection of external envelope data, to coordinated surveillance of suspected drop-off locations. And then there was the operational security of the vendor himself. Darknet operators who had read their community's security guidance knew to use Tor exclusively, to never log into their vendor account from a non-Tor connection, to never discuss real identifying details in vendor communications, to never reuse usernames or email addresses across platforms. They knew to use cryptocurrency with proper coin mixing protocols and to never cash out through KYC-compliant exchanges. The history of Darknet prosecutions is substantially a history of defendants who violated one or more of these guidelines, often in ways that seem small at the time and catastrophic in retrospect. A forum post made years before using the same username, a return address that matched a real location, a withdrawal to an exchange account. A package sent from a post office 2 blocks from a home address. Hughes was living in San Jose when federal agents built their case. The Northern District of Illinois is the judicial district that covers Chicago, and the fact that the prosecution landed there, rather than in the Northern District of California, which covers San Jose, reflects a standard feature of federal drug cases involving the mail. The crime is charged where the drugs were distributed, where packages were received, where the conspiracy operated, not necessarily where the defendant physically resided. Establishing federal jurisdiction in Illinois required the prosecution to demonstrate that Hughes's operation touched Illinois, that packages moved there, that buyers were there, that the conspiracy had a nexus to the district. That was apparently not difficult to establish. The trial itself, conducted in the fall of 2025, presented the federal jury with the full evidentiary package: the controlled transactions, the cryptocurrency records, the postal evidence, the marketplace data, the technical documentation of the vendor account and its listings. Hughes was charged under federal drug statutes for conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute methamphetamine, along with distribution counts tied to specific transactions. The free sample promotion that Hughes had run to attract new customers on Nemesis Market presumably featured in the prosecution's account of the conspiracy's scope and Hughes's intent. A jury looking at a vendor who advertised narcotics, offered complimentary doses to first-time buyers, and shipped meth to buyers across state lines through the United States mail, would not have needed much additional persuasion on the question of intent. Guilty. November 2025, on every count that mattered. Then came the sentencing phase, and the question of how many years a federal judge was prepared to impose on a man who had turned a darknet platform into a private narcotics distribution company. Federal drug sentencing operates under a system of guidelines that take into account the drug type, the quantity, and a range of aggravating and mitigating factors. Methamphetamine, particularly actual methamphetamine as opposed to a methamphetamine mixture, carries some of the harshest guideline calculations in the federal sentencing table. The quantity involved in a darknet vendor case can be substantial even if no single shipment was enormous, because the prosecution aggregates all transactions across the life of the conspiracy. A vendor who shipped a few grams at a time but did so hundreds of times over months or years quickly accumulates a drug weight that pushes the guidelines calculation into territory measured in decades. The sentencing memoranda filed in cases like Hughes's typically involve competing presentations, the government arguing for a sentence that reflects the seriousness of systematic narcotics distribution through the mail, the defense arguing for mitigation based on personal history, mental health, addiction, or other factors. Judge Kness, who had presided over the trial and had therefore heard the evidence in full, would have been familiar with both the scope of the operation and the individual circumstances presented at sentencing. On May 26, 2026, Judge John Kness sentenced Darren Hughes to more than 26 years in federal prison, at age 39 at the time of sentencing. That means Hughes will be well into his 60s before he completes his sentence, assuming he serves the full term, minus whatever statutory good time credit the Bureau of Prisons applies, his life as he had constructed it. The vendor account, the cryptocurrency wallet, the packages moving through post offices in San Jose, was over. The case against Hughes was not the most prominent darknet prosecution in American history. It did not involve the scale of Silk Road, the organizational complexity of Alphabet, or the sheer cryptocurrency volume of operations like Hydra. Hughes was a single vendor, not a marketplace operator or a cartel supplier, but that is precisely what makes the case instructive. The machinery of federal investigation that was deployed against him, the DEA's crypto tracing capability, the Postal Inspection Service's mail interdiction expertise, the Northern District of Illinois' federal prosecutors, was not assembled specifically for Hughes. It was built over more than a decade of prosecuting darknet cases, refined through hundreds of investigations, and by the time it turned its attention to his Nemesis market storefront, it was mature, practiced, and extremely good at its job. What federal investigators learned, starting with the Silk Road case in 2013 and continuing through every major Darknet prosecution since, is that the digital anonymity these platforms offer is real but not absolute, and that the intersection of digital commerce with physical logistics creates vulnerabilities that persist regardless of how sophisticated the encryption becomes. You can route your internet traffic through 100 relay nodes. You can use privacy coins and mixing services and tumble your Bitcoin through dozens of intermediate wallets, but the package still has to move through the mail. The methamphetamine still has to go from a human being's hands into a postal container and travel through a physical sorting facility. And at every one of those physical points, federal investigators have developed tools and procedures and legal authorities that are specifically designed to find it. The Postal Inspection Service had by the mid-2020s developed a sophisticated interdiction apparatus for Darknet-related mail. Packages flagged by profile, certain origination-destination patterns, certain weight and size characteristics, certain postage payment methods underwent additional scrutiny. In districts with high prosecution rates, USPS had established dedicated task forces working alongside DEA field offices. The training, the technology, and the interagency coordination surrounding an investigation, like the one targeting Hughes, represented an institutional investment that the federal government had made deliberately in direct response to the growth of the Darknet drug market. The DEA's role in cases like this encompasses not just the crypto tracing, but the controlled purchase operations, undercover buys conducted through the marketplace itself, which create documented transaction records and physical evidence simultaneously. An undercover agent who purchases methamphetamine from a vendor account and receives the package has established in a single transaction that the account is actively distributing, that it is distributing the substance alleged, and that it can reach the judicial district where the buy was made. When combined with blockchain analysis that ties the cryptocurrency payment to a specific wallet, and postal evidence that ties the outgoing package to a specific origination point, each controlled buy adds a layer to an evidentiary architecture that becomes progressively harder to challenge. There is something worth examining in the marketing choice that Hughes reportedly made: the free sample offer to new customers. It reflects a version of the Darknet vendor community's own advice to operators looking to build a reputation. Start with small quantities, accumulate positive reviews, grow your customer base. But it also reflects a fundamental misapprehension of the risk calculus. The same mechanism that builds a vendor's marketplace reputation, the transaction record, the shipping activity, the pattern of sales, is the same mechanism that federal investigators use to build a prosecution. Every positive review from a satisfied buyer is, from the government's perspective, documentation of a completed distribution. The vendor account's visible sales history, preserved in marketplace scrapes and undercover screenshots, became the prosecution's roadmap. The Nemesis market itself, the platform where Hughes operated, would face its own reckoning. Darknet markets have historically operated under a kind of grim actuarial certainty. They tend not to survive long before law enforcement action, an exit scam by the administrators, or internal disruption takes them down. Vendors who build their operations on a single platform are betting on the continued existence of a criminal enterprise that has every reason to eventually fail. Hughes was operating on Nemesis when federal investigators found him. The platform he depended on for his customer base was itself a federal investigative target by definition. Every major Darknet market operating in the mid-2020s was subject to active intelligence collection by DEA, FBI, HSI, and international partners cooperating through frameworks like the Joint Criminal Opioid and Darknet Enforcement Team known as J-Code, which the DOJ had established specifically to coordinate multi-agency Darknet investigations. By the time Judge Kness read the sentence in that Chicago courtroom in May of 2026, the investigative work was long complete. The DEA agents and postal inspectors who had built the case had moved on to other investigations. The cryptocurrency analysts had closed their files on this particular wallet cluster and opened new ones. The Northern District of Illinois prosecutors had won their conviction and were preparing for the next trial. The system that had found Darren Hughes, traced him, charged him, tried him, and sentenced him to more than a quarter century in federal prison, was already looking for the next vendor, the next marketplace, the next shipment moving through the mail. The Darknet drug economy had always operated on the premise that anonymity could defeat law enforcement. What case after case, from Ross Ulbricht to Alexander Casas of Alpha Bay, to the operators of Hydra to Darren Hughes of San Jose, had demonstrated was that the premise was wrong. Anonymity was never absolute, and every crack in the operational security, however small, was a thread that trained investigators knew how to pull. 26 years. In the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Hughes would be processed, assigned to a facility, and begin serving the longest sentence a judge had ever imposed on him. One measured not in months, but in decades. The packages had stopped moving. The Nemesis market vendor account was closed, and in a federal courthouse in Chicago, on a May morning in 2026, another chapter in the long federal campaign against the Darknet drug trade had come to its formal, irreversible conclusion.